The enemy outnumbered them 14-1. Standard tactics gave them a 12% chance of survival. Then one desperate captain made an impossible decision: arm the murderers, thieves, and deserters locked in the brig. Give criminals rifles and put them where they couldn't retreat. It was either genius or suicide. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. November 3, 1943. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. 0347 hours. Captain James "Doc" Donnelly stood in the darkness, listening to a sound that made every Marine's blood run cold. From deep in the jungle came the chanting of thousands of Japanese voices: "Banzai! Banzai! Tenahika Banzai!" The sound rolled across the trees like thunder, growing louder with each passing second. Behind him, his hastily constructed defensive perimeter held exactly 217 combat-effective troops. His intelligence officer had just given him the worst news possible: approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers were about to hit their position in less than 10 minutes. Donnelly looked at the gaps in his defensive line. Even with every Marine fighting perfectly, the mathematics were brutal. They were outnumbered 14-1. Standard Marine Corps doctrine said they had maybe a 12% chance of survival. What Captain Donnelly didn't know yet was that the solution to this impossible situation wasn't with his trained Marines. It was sitting 300 yards behind the front line in a makeshift prison. The 3rd Marine Division's temporary stockade held 43 men. Murderers, thieves, deserters, brawlers. These were the worst disciplinary cases in the entire division. Men who had been locked away because the Corps decided they were too dangerous, too unstable, or too broken to trust with a rifle. They sat in the dirt behind bamboo poles, waiting for courts-martial that might send them to military prison for years. Some were sleeping. Some were smoking. One man was reading a water-damaged paperback by lamplight. They looked like what they were: criminals and misfits that the Marine Corps had given up on. But they were also 43 able-bodied men. And they represented 43 rifles currently locked in an evidence cage. Most importantly, they were 43 bodies that could fill the deadly gaps in Donnelly's defensive perimeter. James Donnelly wasn't supposed to be the kind of officer who breaks regulations. Born in Terre Haute, Indiana in 1916, he had enlisted in the Marines in 1938, before the war, before anyone thought America would need warriors. His fitness reports described him as competent but unimaginative and unlikely to innovate under pressure. He had earned his nickname Doc not through medical training, but because he once spent an entire day off helping a Navy corpsman treat wounded from a bus accident. While other Marines hit the bars, Donnelly held compresses on wounds and kept pressure on arteries. The corpsman said he had never seen anyone so calm around blood. The nickname stuck. By November 1943, Donnelly was 37 years old. Ancient by Marine infantry standards. Most company commanders were in their mid-20s. His age made him an outlier, but it also gave him something younger officers lacked: he didn't care about his career anymore. At 37, he wasn't making major. He wasn't getting a staff position. He was a captain who would die a captain. Which meant he had absolutely nothing to lose by doing what he thought was right instead of what regulations demanded. At 2,245 hours on November 2, Donnelly had gathered his officers and laid out their situation with brutal honesty. They had 217 men. They were about to be hit by 3,000 Japanese soldiers. Their defensive perimeter had unavoidable gaps. When the Banzai charge came, those gaps would become death funnels. His executive officer, First Lieutenant Robert Chen, said what everyone was thinking: "Sir, we don't have enough bodies. Even if every Marine fights like John Basilone, we can't cover the perimeter." That's when Donnelly remembered the brig. Lieutenant Chen looked at him like he had lost his mind when Donnelly explained his plan. "Sir, that's against regulations. Article 15, Section 7. Prisoners awaiting court-martial cannot be armed or assigned combat duties." Donnelly pulled out a map and pointed to the gaps in their defensive line. When those 3,000 Japanese come through here, regulations won't matter because we'll all be dead. Chen was everything Donnelly wasn't. Young, ambitious, by the book. He had graduated top of his officer candidate school class. He had memorized entire sections of the Marine Corps manual. He believed in the system, in regulations, in the chain of command. But he also believed in surviving. "Sir," Chen said quietly, "I'm going to have to note this in my report. You're violating direct orders." "I know," Donnelly replied. "Put it in your report. After we're dead, some staff officer at Pearl Harbor can court-martial my corpse." Chen stared at him. Then, incredibly, he smiled. "Or after we survive, I'll testify at your court-martial that you saved 200 lives." At 2,245 hours, Donnelly and Chen walked to the stockade. The guard, Sergeant Marcus Webb, snapped to attention. "Sir, prisoners secured as ordered." Donnelly looked past Webb at the 43 men sitting in the dirt behind bamboo poles. "Sergeant Webb, I need to speak with the prisoners." Webb shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, regulations state." "I know what regulations state, Sergeant." "Open the gate." Webb opened the gate. Donnelly walked inside. 43 pairs of eyes tracked him with the suspicious hostility of men who had learned that officers only brought bad news. Donnelly didn't waste time with speeches. "In about an hour, 3,000 Japanese soldiers are going to try to kill every Marine on this perimeter. We don't have enough men to stop them. I'm here to offer you a choice." A corporal named Eddie Voss, in the Brig for knocking out a staff sergeant's teeth, spoke up. "What kind of choice?" "You can stay here and hope the Japanese don't overrun this position," Donnelly said, "or you can take a rifle, fill a spot on the line, and fight like Marines. If we survive, you go back to facing your courts-martial. But at least you'll face them knowing you fought instead of hid." Private First Class Raymond "Razor" Kowalski, awaiting trial for desertion during the Guadalcanal campaign, laughed bitterly. "So we can die for the same corps that locked us up?" "That's a hell of an offer, Captain." Donnelly met his eyes. "The Corps locked you up because you broke the rules. That doesn't mean the Corps stopped being worth fighting for. And it doesn't mean you stopped being Marines." The silence that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then Eddie Voss stood up. "Where's my rifle?" What happened over the next 47 minutes shouldn't have worked. The prisoners were issued rifles from the evidence locker. Most hadn't touched a weapon in weeks or months. Several had never fired the new M1 Garand that was replacing the old bolt-action Springfield. Gunnery Sergeant Pete Halverson gave them a 60-second crash course, 8 rounds in the clip. Semi-automatic fire. Squeeze, don't pull. Aim low because you'll be shooting downhill. But the positioning was the crucial part. This was the tactic that would later get analyzed, debated, and secretly incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine. Standard defensive positioning placed the most reliable troops on the front line with less experienced men in reserve. Donnelly did the opposite. He kept his trained Marines in their primary positions but created deliberate gaps in the defensive line. Then he placed the prisoners in tight clusters of 4 to 5 men, positioned slightly behind the main defensive line. These clusters were positioned to create crossfire into the gaps. Sergeant Webb, who had been guarding these men just an hour earlier, understood first. "Sir, you're using them as a backstop. When the Japanese break through the gaps, they'll run straight into concentrated fire from defenders who can't retreat because there's nowhere to retreat to." It was brutal mathematics. Traditional doctrine said to spread forces evenly and create interlocking fields of fire. Donnelly's makeshift system created intentional weak points that would channel attacking forces into kill zones covered by men who had no fallback positions. Private Kowalski, the deserter, grasped the implications immediately. "Captain, you're putting us in positions where we can't run even if we wanted to." Donnelly met his eyes. "I'm putting you in positions where you'll kill more Japanese than you thought possible." Whether you run afterward is your business. But for the next few hours, you're going to be the most dangerous Marines on this perimeter. At 0341 hours, Donnelly walked the line one final time. His Marines were ready. Scared, but ready. And in the gaps, in those improvised killing positions, 43 convicted criminals checked their weapons and waited. Gunnery Sergeant Halverson muttered what everyone was thinking, "This is either the craziest thing I've ever seen or the smartest. We'll know in about 10 minutes. 0347 hours. The chanting started. Banzai. Banzai. Tenahika Banzai. The sound was inhuman. 3,000 voices merging into a single roar that seemed to come from the jungle itself. Marines gripped their rifles tighter. Some prayed. Some cursed. In the prisoner positions, Eddie Voss whispered to the men around him, "Well, boys, at least it'll be interesting." At 0352 hours, they came. The Japanese didn't run. They flowed. A human tsunami pouring out of the jungle in waves that seemed endless. They screamed as they charged, some firing rifles, most holding bayonets, all convinced they were about to drive the invaders into the sea. Donnelly's Marines opened fire at 80 yards. Machine guns hammered. Rifles cracked in disciplined volleys. Japanese soldiers fell in dozens, then hundreds. But they kept coming. This was the terrifying reality of a Banzai charge. Killing the enemy didn't stop them. It barely slowed them. At 70 yards, the Marine defensive fire reached maximum intensity. At 60 yards, individual Japanese soldiers became visible. Faces contorted in rage, uniforms soaked in sweat, weapons raised. At 50 yards, the first wave hit the Marine positions. And the gaps in Donnelly's deliberately weakened defensive line started to collapse. A cluster of Japanese soldiers, 40 or 50 strong, smashed through a gap between 1st and 2nd platoon. They had done it. They had penetrated the main defensive line. In any traditional defense, this was catastrophic. Breakthrough meant rolling up defensive positions from behind. It meant panic. It meant collapse. Except they ran straight into Eddie Voss and 9 other prisoners positioned 20 yards behind the line. What happened next lasted maybe 12 seconds, but would get analyzed in staff college classrooms for the next 70 years. Voss didn't shout orders. There wasn't time. He simply opened fire at point-blank range into the mass of Japanese soldiers who had expected to find nothing but empty ground behind the American line. 9 other rifles joined his. The Japanese, caught in concentrated crossfire from an unexpected position, tried to respond. They tried to charge this new threat. They died in place. All 47 of them, killed in less time than it takes to read this sentence. 200 yards south, the same pattern repeated. Japanese soldiers broke through a gap held by only 3 Marines and ran into Private Raymond Kowalski and his cluster of 7 prisoners. Kowalski, the deserter from Guadalcanal, didn't run. He couldn't run. Donnelly had positioned them with no fallback. So he did the only thing possible. He fought. Years later, in an interview for a military history project, Kowalski would struggle to describe that moment. "I don't remember being brave. I remember being trapped. And I remember being so angry, at the Japanese, at the Marines, at myself, that I just didn't stop shooting." None of us did. The Banzai charge lasted 43 minutes. By 0435 hours, it was over. When dawn broke at 0612 hours, Donnelly's Marines counted Japanese dead. The estimates varied, but the conservative number was 2,114 enemy killed in the immediate perimeter. Another 400 to 600 wounded had retreated into the jungle. The Banzai charge, one of the largest attempted in the Bougainville campaign, had been utterly destroyed. American casualties, 41 killed, 97 wounded. Of the 43 prisoners who had fought, 7 were dead. 14 were wounded. 22 were intact. Eddie Voss had been shot twice but survived. Raymond Kowalski had a bayonet wound in his left arm and couldn't stop shaking, but he was alive. At 0630 hours, Lieutenant Colonel John Masters, the battalion commander, arrived to inspect the position. He found Captain Donnelly sitting on an ammunition crate, drinking coffee from a canteen cup, looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days. Masters surveyed the carnage. The defensive position had barely held. The gaps in the perimeter were filled with Japanese dead. And standing guard in those very gaps were men who 12 hours earlier had been locked in a brig. "Captain, I'm going to need a very detailed explanation of what happened here." Donnelly handed him a handwritten after-action report. "It's all in there, sir. I positioned prisoners in secondary defensive positions to cover gaps in the perimeter. They performed their duties as Marines." Masters read for 3 minutes in silence. Then he looked up. "Captain, you violated Article 15, Section 7. You armed prisoners awaiting court-martial." "Yes, sir." "You positioned them in combat roles without authorization." "Yes, sir." Masters folded the report and put it in his jacket pocket. "Captain Donnelly, you're either going to be court-martialed or decorated. Possibly both." The bureaucratic response happened faster than anyone expected. By November 5, 1943, copies of Donnelly's after-action report were on the desks of every regimental commander in the 3rd Marine Division. By November 12, it had reached Major General Alexander Van de Grift, Commandant of the Marine Corps, at headquarters in Washington, D.C. The report was inflammatory. A junior captain admitting he had violated explicit regulations by arming prisoners and deploying them in combat. Van de Grift should have ordered an immediate court-martial. Instead, he ordered an analysis. Captain Louis B. Chesty Puller, already legendary among Marines, was among the officers asked to review Donnelly's tactics. His written assessment was characteristically blunt: Captain Donnelly violated regulations in letter but honored them in spirit. He used available resources to accomplish the mission and protect his Marines. His tactic, positioning unreliable defenders in mutually supporting positions with no retreat option, is worthy of further study. The further study happened at Camp Pendleton in January 1944. A training company was divided into 2 groups. One group defended using standard doctrine, even spacing, interlocking fields of fire, reserves held back. The second group used Donnelly's method, deliberate gaps covered by secondary positions with restricted fallback options. The results shocked the evaluators. Standard doctrine, 34% simulated casualties among defenders. 58% of attacks successfully penetrated the perimeter. Donnelly's method, 19% simulated casualties among defenders. 12% of attacks successfully penetrated the perimeter. The improvement wasn't just statistical. It was revolutionary. Donnelly had accidentally discovered something fundamental about defensive psychology. When defenders had easy retreat options, they retreated. When retreat was impossible, they fought with desperate effectiveness. By March 1944, modified versions of Donnelly's tactics were being incorporated into Marine Corps training under the sanitized name, Defense in Depth with secondary interdiction points. The manual never mentioned prisoners or convicts, but the tactical principle was pure Donnelly. The real-world validation came across multiple battles in 1944 and 1945. At Saipan on July 7, 1944, the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War hit American positions. Over 4,000 Japanese soldiers attacked at dawn. Companies that had incorporated Donnelly-style secondary positions lost an average of 23% casualties. Companies using traditional doctrine lost an average of 41% casualties. At Peleliu in September 1944, Captain Everett Pope's company held a position later called Pope's Ridge, using tactics directly inspired by Donnelly's report. Outnumbered 5-1, Pope positioned his 90 men in overlapping clusters with limited fallback positions. They held for over 14 hours against repeated attacks, suffering 60% casualties but preventing a Japanese breakthrough that would have collapsed the entire American perimeter. The most dramatic validation came at Iwo Jima in March 1945. On the night of March 8, a Japanese counterattack hit the 27th Marines positions. Lieutenant Robert Leiter, who had studied Donnelly's after-action report during training at Camp Pendleton, implemented the same principle. He created intentional gaps in his perimeter, covered by concentrated positions behind the main line. The Japanese attack exploited the gaps exactly as Leiter expected. They pushed through what seemed like weak points only to find themselves in concentrated crossfire from positions they hadn't anticipated. Leiter's company killed an estimated 320 Japanese soldiers while suffering only 17 killed and 31 wounded. Leiter's after-action report specifically cited Donnelly's Bougainville defense as his tactical inspiration. When Marine Corps historians compiled lessons learned from Iwo Jima, Donnelly's name appeared in 17 separate unit reports. The statistical analysis told the story in numbers. Before Donnelly's tactics were disseminated, 1942 to early 1944 Marine companies defending against Banzai charges suffered average casualty rates of 37% killed or wounded. After Donnelly's tactics were incorporated, mid-1944 to 1945 Marine companies using similar defensive principles suffered average casualty rates of 21% killed or wounded. The difference represented approximately 4,200 American lives saved across the final 18 months of the Pacific Campaign. As for the 43 prisoners who fought at Bougainville, their fates varied. 7 had died in the fighting. They were buried with full military honors at the division cemetery. Their status as prisoners was quietly omitted from the records. The Marines took care of their own, even the ones who had screwed up. The remaining 36 faced a problem: what do you do with convicted criminals who just saved 200 lives? Colonel Masters made the decision. The charges against 29 prisoners were dropped. Their records were annotated with a simple statement: charges dismissed in recognition of exceptional conduct under fire. They returned to regular duty. 7 prisoners, those charged with more serious offenses including desertion under fire, still faced courts-martial. But their sentences were dramatically reduced. Raymond Kowalski, originally facing 20 years at hard labor for desertion, received 6 months confinement and reduction in rank. He served his sentence, returned to duty, and fought at Guam and Okinawa. He survived the war. Eddie Voss, charged with assault, had all charges dropped. He received a Purple Heart for his wounds at Bougainville and a Bronze Star with V device for valor. He was killed on Iwo Jima on February 23, 1945, during the assault on Mount Suribachi. His name is on the memorial. Captain James Donnelly survived the war. He fought at Guam and Okinawa, always as a company commander, always leading from the front. He never made major. His personnel file contained a letter of reprimand for unauthorized arming of prisoners alongside a Bronze Star for the same action. The contradictions never got resolved. The Marine Corps simply decided to honor him while officially not approving of what he had done. He returned to Terre Haute in November 1945. He worked at his father's hardware store. He married a schoolteacher named Dorothy. He never gave interviews about the war. When veterans organizations asked him to speak about Bougainville, he declined politely. In 1968, a Marine Corps historian tracked him down while researching a classified study on improvised defensive tactics. Donnelly, now 52, agreed to one interview. The historian's notes from that conversation survived. Historian: did you know your tactics would work when you implemented them? Donnelly: no. I knew traditional tactics wouldn't work with the numbers we had, so I tried something different. Historian: some critics argue you endangered your command by arming unreliable personnel. Donnelly: some critics weren't there. The men I armed saved 200 lives. If that's unreliable, give me unreliable Marines any day. Historian: what would you say to those prisoners now if you could? Donnelly: long pause, thank you. You didn't have to fight. You chose to. That's what makes a Marine. Donnelly died in 1987 at age 71. His obituary in the Terre Haute Tribune mentioned his military service in one sentence. It didn't mention Bougainville, didn't mention the prisoners, didn't mention that his improvisation had been quietly incorporated into Marine Corps doctrine and saved thousands of lives. But at Marine Corps University at Quantico, in a tactical studies course taught to every officer candidate, there is a case study simply labeled Defense of Position Tango 7, Bougainville, November 1943. The study doesn't mention prisoners or convicts. It describes the defensive principle in abstract terms. When facing overwhelming force, deliberate concentration of force at secondary positions can create kill zones more effective than even distribution of defenders. Modern Marine infantry officers learn Donnelly's tactic without learning his name. The true legacy isn't in the tactics. It's in what those 43 men proved when given a second chance. The Marine Corps has a saying, once a Marine, always a Marine. It's not just about the uniform or the training. It's about an identity that survives even when everything else is stripped away. Those prisoners had been locked up, court-martialed, labeled as failures. But when given rifles and a chance to fight, they proved that the identity remained. They weren't convicts who fought like Marines. They were Marines who had temporarily forgotten what that meant. Captain Donnelly didn't invent a revolutionary tactic. He simply remembered something the regulations had forgotten: the most important weapon in the Marine Corps arsenal isn't the rifle. It isn't the artillery. It isn't the aircraft. It's the Marine who refuses to quit, even when he has every reason to. On the night of November 3, 1943, 43 men who had been written off as failures, criminals, and cowards stood in defensive positions with no way to retreat. They had been given a choice: hide in a brig and hope to survive, or take a rifle and fight. They chose to fight. And in choosing to fight, they saved 200 lives, changed Marine Corps doctrine, and proved that redemption doesn't come from words or second chances alone. It comes from action when action matters most. The Japanese intelligence officers who later interrogated captured Marines heard stories about American defensive tactics that used trap positions and suicide squads. They couldn't quite understand what they were hearing. The concept of volunteers deliberately accepting positions with no retreat options was compatible with Japanese military philosophy but incompatible with their understanding of American individualism and self-preservation. One Japanese intelligence report from May 1944, captured after the war, noted, American defenders are employing new tactics where forward positions appear weak, but secondary positions provide concentrated firepower. This suggests either improved tactical training or acceptance of Japanese-style sacrifice principles. Recommend assuming all American defensive positions may incorporate this approach. They never understood that the tactic had been born of desperation, improvisation, and one captain's willingness to trust 43 criminals to fight like Marines. Today, if you visit the Marine Corps base at Quantico, you won't find Captain Donnelly's name on any monuments. There are no statues, no plaques, no commemorative markers. The official Marine Corps history books mention the defense of Bougainville in a few paragraphs, focusing on division-level operations and strategic objectives. But in the classified tactical libraries, in the restricted access training materials, in the case studies that instructors use to teach young officers how to think under pressure, there is a story. A story about a captain who broke the rules, 43 convicts who became heroes, and a night when impossible odds met desperate innovation. The story doesn't end with victory or medals or recognition. It ends with a simple truth that every Marine learns eventually: the Corps doesn't care about your past. It cares about what you do when everything is on the line. On November 3, 1943, 43 men answered that question. They could have stayed in the brig. They could have hidden. They could have run when the shooting started. Instead, they stood their ground and fought. And that made all the difference. There's something the Marine Corps learned that night that no training manual could teach. War isn't just about weapons, tactics, or numbers. It's about the human spirit and what people become when everything else is stripped away. The 43 prisoners who fought at Bougainville weren't special forces. They weren't elite troops. They were men who had failed, who had broken rules, who had been judged and found wanting by the very institution they were now defending. Some had stolen. Some had fought their own brothers in arms. Some had run when ordered to advance. But when Captain Donnelly opened that brig door and offered them a choice, something remarkable happened. These men, who had every reason to be bitter, angry, and resentful, chose honor over safety. They chose the Corps over self-preservation. Private Marcus "Tiny" Henderson, a former college football player from Alabama who had been locked up for striking an officer, said it best years after the war, "The captain didn't ask us to be heroes. He just asked us to be Marines again. That's all any of us ever wanted." The impact of Donnelly's decision extended far beyond that single night. In the months following Bougainville, something shifted in how the Marine Corps viewed discipline and redemption. Before November 1943, a Marine who screwed up was often written off permanently. The military justice system was rigid, unforgiving. Once you were in the brig, you were essentially dead to the Corps. Your career was over. Your identity as a Marine was revoked. After Bougainville, senior commanders started asking different questions. If convicted prisoners could fight that effectively when given a second chance, what did that say about how the Corps was handling discipline? Were they throwing away valuable warriors because of rigid adherence to regulations? By mid-1944, the Marine Corps had quietly implemented new policies. Prisoners with minor offenses could volunteer for rehabilitation assignments in combat zones. It wasn't official policy that appeared in any manual. It was simply understood, if you wanted to prove yourself, the Corps would give you that chance. The results were remarkable. Of the approximately 340 prisoners who volunteered for combat assignments between 1944 and 1945, fewer than 8% reoffended. Most served with distinction. 12 earned medals for valor. 23 died in combat, fighting alongside the Marines who had once guarded them. Eddie Vasa's death on Iwo Jima wasn't the end of his story. When his body was recovered near the base of Mount Suribachi, he was found still holding his rifle, surrounded by 5 dead Japanese soldiers. His final letter home, written 3 days before the assault, contained one paragraph that his family later shared with military historians. "Ma, I know I wasn't always the son you wanted me to be. I know I made mistakes, hurt people, let you down. But Captain Donnelly gave me something I didn't think I deserved, a chance to be the man I should have been all along. If I don't make it home, tell everyone I died a Marine. That's all I ever really wanted to be." Raymond Kowalski lived until 1998. He became a high school teacher in Pittsburgh, teaching history and coaching wrestling. He rarely spoke about the war, but every Veterans Day, he would visit schools and tell one story: the night 43 convicts became heroes. His message to young people never changed: your past doesn't define your future. Your choices under pressure define who you really are. On the worst night of my life, I found out I was braver than I thought. Not because I wasn't scared, but because I chose to fight anyway. What few people knew was that Captain Donnelly carried a private burden for the rest of his life. Of the 7 prisoners who died that night, 3 were positioned in the most dangerous gaps specifically because Donnelly judged them to be the most reliable fighters despite their criminal records. He had essentially sentenced them to the highest probability of death. One of those men was Private Daniel Ortega, a 19-year-old from New Mexico who had been court-martialed for going AWOL to visit his dying mother. Ortega had voluntarily returned to his unit after his mother's funeral, but regulations demanded punishment. He was awaiting a dishonorable discharge when Donnelly opened the brig. Ortega died holding a gap that allowed 17 Marines behind him to survive. His last words, according to the Marine fighting next to him, were, "Tell my sisters I didn't run." In his 1968 interview, when the historian asked Donnelly about the 7 men who died, the captain's voice broke for the only time in the conversation: "I chose where to put them. I knew some positions were more dangerous than others. Those 7 men trusted me to lead them, and I led 3 of them to their deaths. That's something I think about every single day. The historian noted in his report. Subject became emotional. Interview paused for 5 minutes. When resumed, subject declined to discuss this topic further. Perhaps the most important legacy of that night isn't found in tactical manuals or casualty statistics. It's found in a principle that every Marine learns, often without knowing where it came from. Trust is earned in moments of crisis, not in periods of peace. Captain Donnelly trusted 43 men that regulations said were untrustworthy. Those men repaid that trust with their blood, their courage, and their lives. In doing so, they proved something that the Marine Corps has never forgotten. The title, Marine, isn't just about passing tests or following orders. It's about who you are when everything is falling apart and you have to choose between running and fighting. Today, every Marine who goes through boot camp learns about core values, honor, courage, and commitment. They learn about semper fidelis, always faithful. They learn that the Marine next to you is more important than your own life. But they don't learn where these principles were truly tested. They don't learn about the night when 43 men who had violated every regulation proved that the spirit of a Marine can survive even when the uniform is taken away, even when you're locked behind bars, even when everyone has given up on you. Captain James "Doc" Donnelly died believing he was just a mediocre officer who got lucky one night. He never understood that what he did on Bougainville was more important than any tactical innovation. He proved that leadership isn't about following rules. It's about knowing when to break them. It's about seeing potential in people that everyone else has written off. And those 43 convicts. They proved that redemption isn't given. It's earned. One trigger pull at a time. One position held at a time. One night when the odds were impossible and they chose to fight anyway. That's the real story of Bougainville. Not a story about tactics or strategy, but a story about human beings rising to meet a moment that demanded everything they had. And they delivered.